Admiral Quan pressed his hands against the cold metal railing of the command bridge, staring down at the small blue world that hung in the darkness of space like a jewel. The planet looked so peaceful from up here, with white clouds swirling over green and brown continents. It was hard to believe that billions of people lived down there, completely unaware that their lives were about to change forever. The Imperial dreadnought Eternal Conquest was massive, stretching over 2 kilometers from bow to stern. Its dark hull bristled with weapons that could level entire cities with a single blast. This ship alone carried enough firepower to conquer most worlds without breaking a sweat. And it was just one of 50 ships in Admiral Quan's fleet. Commander Day walked up beside him, holding a data tablet in his hands. The young officer had served under Quan for 3 years now, and had seen dozens of worlds fall to the Empire. His face showed the same calm confidence that came with easy victories. "Admiral, the scanning teams have finished their analysis," Day said, handing over the tablet. "These humans are incredibly primitive. They're still using chemical rockets to reach their own moon. Their most powerful weapons are basic nuclear devices that would barely scratch our ship's paint." Quan scrolled through the technical reports. The humans had crude satellites floating in orbit, simple space stations that looked like they might fall apart at any moment. Their military technology was laughably outdated compared to the Empire's energy weapons and force shields. Most worlds at this level of development surrendered the moment they saw an Imperial fleet. "How long do you estimate the conquest will take?" Quan asked. 3 days at most, sir. Probably less. Once we destroy a few of their major cities, the rest will surrender quickly. They always do." The Admiral nodded and walked over to the communications console. He had done this same routine hundreds of times before, on hundreds of different worlds. The script never changed, and neither did the results. He activated the broadcast system that would beam his message to every radio, television, and communication device on the planet below. "People of Earth," his voice echoed through the ship's speakers. "This is Admiral Quan of the Galactic Empire. Your world is now under Imperial jurisdiction. You have 1 hour to surrender your governments and military forces unconditionally. Resistance will result in the complete destruction of your civilization." The bridge fell silent as they waited for a response. Usually the reply came within minutes. Panicked voices begging for mercy, or frightened leaders asking for terms. Sometimes there was just silence as entire governments collapsed in terror, but this time was different. The communication system crackled to life, and a clear, steady voice spoke just 4 simple words. "Come and try." Commander Day burst out laughing. "Did they just dare us to attack them? These primitives have no idea what they're facing. A single blast from our main cannon could wipe out their largest city." Other officers on the bridge chuckled and shook their heads. They had encountered stubborn species before, but none this technologically inferior had ever shown such foolish bravery. It was almost amusing. Admiral Quan, however, felt a strange chill run down his spine. In all his years of conquest, he had learned to trust his instincts. Something about that response bothered him, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The voice hadn't sounded afraid or desperate. It had sounded ready. "Sir," Commander Day asked, "should I begin the orbital bombardment?" Quan stared down at the blue planet one more time. Those 4 words kept echoing in his mind. "Come and try." Such confidence from such a primitive species. It didn't make sense. "Admiral," Day pressed. "Proceed with standard invasion protocols," Quan finally ordered. "But stay alert. Something feels different about this one." As the ship's weapons began to charge with a low humming sound, none of them realized they were about to face an enemy unlike any the Galactic Empire had ever encountered. An enemy that would change the course of galactic history forever. Lieutenant Shin gripped the controls of his sleek Imperial fighter as it sliced through Earth's atmosphere. The cockpit displays showed perfect readouts, shields at full power, energy weapons charged, targeting systems locked onto the primitive human airbase below. This should be the easiest mission of his career. Behind him flew 11 other Imperial fighters, their silver hulls gleaming in the sunlight. Each ship was a marvel of galactic engineering, equipped with weapons that could punch through solid steel and shields that could deflect nuclear blasts. The human aircraft they were about to face looked like flying scrap metal in comparison. "Target acquired," came the voice of his wingman, Lieutenant Juan, over the radio. "I'm seeing about 20 human jets on the runway. Their engines aren't even running." Shin smiled inside his helmet. "Easy pickings, remember the briefing. Disable their aircraft first, then secure the airfield for ground troops. These humans probably don't even know we're coming." But as they approached the military base, something unexpected happened. Alarms began blaring across the human facility, and those primitive jets suddenly roared to life. Within seconds, human fighters were launching into the sky with surprising speed. "How did they detect us so quickly?" Lieutenant Juan asked, confusion clear in his voice. "Our ships are supposed to be invisible to their radar." Shin frowned as he watched the human aircraft climb toward them. The jets looked ancient compared to Imperial technology. They used actual fuel instead of energy cores, had crude metal wings instead of force fields, and their weapons were simple projectiles rather than energy beams. By all logic, this should be a massacre. The first human jet opened fire, and Shin easily dodged the primitive bullets. His energy shields didn't even flicker. "These humans are pathetic," he radioed to his squadron. "Let's finish this quickly." But then something strange happened. The humans weren't flying like any enemy he had faced before. Instead of trying to run away or forming defensive formations, they were charging straight at the Imperial fighters with reckless abandon. Their tactics made no sense from a military standpoint. "Why aren't they retreating?" Lieutenant Juan asked, as a human jet flew directly into his line of fire, seemingly unconcerned about being shot down. Shin targeted one of the human fighters and fired his energy cannon. The primitive jet exploded instantly, pieces of metal spinning through the air. But instead of frightening the other human pilots, this seemed to make them even more aggressive. That's when Shin saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. One of the human jets had taken several hits and was clearly going down. Smoke poured from its engines and fire spread across its wings. Any rational pilot would have ejected or tried to make an emergency landing. Instead, the human pilot turned his burning aircraft directly toward Lieutenant Juan's fighter. "He's lost control," Shin shouted into his radio, watching in horror as the damaged human jet accelerated toward his wingman. "No!" Lieutenant Juan's voice came back, filled with sudden terror. "He's not out of control. Look at his flight pattern. He's accelerating on purpose." The burning human fighter slammed into Lieutenant Juan's Imperial ship at full speed. Both aircraft exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the sky. Shin watched his friend die in an instant, killed by an enemy who had chosen to sacrifice his own life just to take down one Imperial fighter. "What kind of species does that?" one of his squadron members whispered over the radio. The battle continued, on the ground, and what Shin saw there was even more disturbing. Human soldiers emerged from hidden bunkers and underground tunnels that their scanners had somehow missed. These weren't the terrified civilians they expected to find. These were trained fighters who seemed to have been preparing for this exact moment. The humans fought with a fury that defied everything Shin had learned about warfare. They charged directly at Imperial energy weapons, used primitive explosives in ways that somehow worked against advanced technology, and never ever retreated, even when retreat was the only logical option. When Shin finally returned to the Eternal Conquest, his hands were still shaking. Admiral Quan listened to his report with growing concern. "They fight like they want to die, sir," Shin concluded. "But somehow, they keep winning. We lost 4 fighters to an enemy that shouldn't have been able to touch us. I've never seen anything like it." Admiral Quan stared out at the blue planet below, and for the first time in his career, he wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. Admiral Quan stood in the war room aboard the Eternal Conquest, staring at the holographic map that floated in the center of the chamber. What he saw there made his stomach turn cold. The entire surface of Earth was covered in red zones, areas where his supposedly superior Imperial forces had been pushed back by primitive humans wielding nothing more than metal bullets and explosive devices. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks since they began what should have been the easiest conquest in Imperial history. By now, this blue planet should have been flying Imperial flags and sending tribute to the Emperor. Instead, Quan found himself calling emergency meetings with his exhausted officers, trying to figure out how everything had gone so terribly wrong. Major Jin shuffled into the room, his uniform torn and dirty from the latest ground battle. Dark circles under his eyes told the story of too many sleepless nights fighting an enemy that refused to follow the rules of warfare. Behind him came Captain Ari from the Orbital Bombardment Division and Commander Day, who had stopped laughing about human bravado weeks ago. "Report," Quan ordered, though he dreaded hearing what his officers had to say. Major Jin activated the tactical display, and the hologram zoomed in to show detailed battle zones across Earth's continents. "Admiral, I've been fighting wars for 15 years and I've never seen anything like this. These humans don't fight like any species we've encountered before." "Explain," Quan said, his voice tight with frustration. "They don't have any central command structure that we can target," Jin continued, pointing to various locations on the map. "When we destroy one of their military bases, 3 more appear overnight in places we've already cleared. They're using underground tunnel systems that our scanners somehow missed, networks that stretch for hundreds of kilometers beneath major cities." Commander Day leaned forward. "How is that possible? Our ground-penetrating sensors should have detected any large underground structures." "That's just it, sir," Jin replied. "These aren't military installations. They're using subway tunnels, sewer systems, old mining shafts, even natural cave networks. They've turned their entire planet into one giant fortress, and we never realized it." Quan felt a headache building behind his eyes. "What about their fighting tactics?" "That's the most disturbing part," Major Jin said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "They don't follow any recognized combat doctrine. A normal enemy would try to protect their supply lines, defend strategic positions, minimize casualties. These humans do the exact opposite." "What do you mean?" "They attack our strongest positions instead of our weakest ones. They sacrifice small groups to learn our weaknesses, then use that information to plan devastating strikes against our main forces. Yesterday, a single human soldier with a primitive explosive device destroyed one of our heavy assault mechs. He died in the explosion, but he took down a machine worth more than most planets' yearly budgets." Captain Ari spoke up from across the table. "Admiral, the orbital bombardments aren't working either. We've tried everything. Precision strikes on military targets, terror bombings of civilian areas, even threats to destroy their entire atmosphere." "And?" Quan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "They just fight harder," Ari said, shaking her head in disbelief. "We destroyed their capital city last week, thinking it would break their spirit. Within 6 hours, they had established 17 new command centers in different cities around the world. It's like they were prepared for us to destroy everything they held dear." Quan walked over to the main display and studied the casualty reports. The numbers were staggering. For every human they killed, the Empire was losing 10 soldiers. For every human vehicle they destroyed, they lost 3 Imperial fighting machines. The mathematics of this war made no sense. "How are primitives with metal projectiles defeating our energy shields?" he asked. Major Jin pulled up a combat recording. "They've figured out our technology weaknesses faster than our own engineers said was possible. They use coordinated attacks to overload our shields, then strike with crude but effective weapons in the split second when our defenses reset. And, sir, they've started copying our technology. That's impossible. It would take them decades to understand our systems." "That's what we thought too," Jin replied grimly. "But yesterday we found humans using modified Imperial energy weapons. They're stripping parts from our destroyed vehicles and somehow making them work with their primitive power systems." Quan slumped into his command chair. In 30 years of military service, he had conquered over 200 worlds. Not once had he faced anything like this. The humans weren't just resisting, they were adapting, learning, and somehow getting stronger with every battle they lost. "Recommendations?" he asked quietly. The room fell silent. Finally, Major Jin spoke the words that no Imperial officer had ever said during a conquest. "Admiral, I think we need reinforcements, a lot of them." For the first time in his career, Admiral Quan sent a message to Imperial High Command requesting additional forces. As he composed the transmission, one thought kept running through his mind. What kind of species becomes more dangerous the more you hurt them? Captain Hana stepped into the communications center of the Imperial flagship, her black uniform bearing the distinctive silver insignia of the Psychological Warfare Division. She was one of the Empire's most effective specialists at breaking enemy morale, having successfully crushed the fighting spirit of dozens of rebellious worlds. Her methods were brutal but efficient, broadcast enough fear and horror, and even the most stubborn species would eventually surrender. "Admiral Kwan has requested our immediate intervention," she announced to her team of specialists. "These humans have proven more resistant than expected, but that just means we need to apply the proper pressure points." Her subordinates activated the massive communication arrays that could override every television, radio, and digital device on the planet below. The Psychological Warfare Division had perfected their techniques over centuries of conquest. Show a population exactly what happened to those who resisted the Empire, and most civilizations would collapse within days. "Begin transmission sequence 7, Hana ordered, settling into her command chair. "Full planetary broadcast." The screens around the communications center lit up with horrifying images, Imperial forces destroying human cities with precision, orbital strikes, captured human soldiers being interrogated, and the smoking ruins of major population centers. The broadcasts were designed to show the humans exactly how hopeless their situation was. "Excellent footage from the Beijing bombardment," one of her technicians noted. "The fear response should be immediate and overwhelming." Captain Hana watched the data streams that monitored human communication networks, waiting to see the familiar pattern of collapsing resistance. Usually, within hours of a fear broadcast, enemy communications would fill with panic, surrender offers, and desperate pleas for mercy. But something strange was happening on Earth. "Captain," her communications specialist called out, confusion clear in his voice. "The human networks are showing increased activity, not decreased. Their military communications are actually becoming more organized." Hana frowned at her displays. "That's impossible. Run the analysis again." The results came back the same. Instead of breaking human morale, the fear broadcasts seemed to be having the opposite effect. Human resistance attacks increased by 300% within 6 hours of the transmission. Their coordination improved. Their tactics became more sophisticated. "These humans are defective," Hana muttered, ordering a second round of even more intense psychological warfare. "Increase the broadcast intensity. Show them the execution footage from the captured pilots." But again, the humans responded in ways that defied everything the Empire knew about warfare psychology. The more suffering they witnessed, the harder they fought. The more destruction they saw, the more determined they became. 3 days later, Admiral Kwan called an emergency briefing. Captain Hana entered the war room to find the senior staff gathered around a holographic display showing data that made her blood run cold. "Captain, your psychological warfare appears to be backfiring," Admiral Kwan said without preamble. "Explain how this is possible." "Sir, I've broken the fighting spirit of 47 different species," Hana replied, struggling to maintain her professional composure. "The fear broadcast should work. These humans are just wrong somehow." Commander Day activated a new display. "It gets worse, Admiral. Intelligence has intercepted human communications, showing they're reverse engineering our captured technology at an impossible rate. Weapons systems that should take them decades to understand, they're copying in weeks." The hologram showed grainy surveillance footage of human scientists working with pieces of destroyed Imperial equipment. They were somehow making primitive versions of energy weapons work with their basic technology. "How are they learning so fast?" Kwan demanded. Before anyone could answer, Commander Yoon burst through the briefing room doors, his face pale with shock. "Admiral, we have a major problem. Long-range sensors have detected human activity in the Proxima sector." The room fell silent. Proxima was 3 star systems away from Earth. "That's impossible," Admiral Kwan said slowly. "They barely had spaceflight when we arrived 4 weeks ago." Commander Yoon activated the main display, showing sensor data from across the local galactic region. "Sir, it appears humans have somehow made contact with resistance movements on worlds we conquered last year. The Altarians, the Vega colonists, even the Centauri mining stations. They're all showing signs of coordinated uprising." Captain Hana stared at the data in disbelief. How could primitives coordinate resistance across multiple star systems? "They've been communicating in secret," Yoon continued, his voice growing more urgent. sharing tactical information, teaching other species their fighting methods. Sir, we're not just fighting humans anymore. This has become a multi-system revolt, and the humans are leading it. Admiral Quan stood frozen as the implications hit him. Across the galactic display, red warning indicators began flashing as emergency protocols activated on world after world. Species that had accepted Imperial rule for decades were suddenly rising up again, using human tactics and human coordination. These humans have turned our own conquered territories against us, Quan whispered, staring at the spreading rebellion. In 4 weeks, they've gone from a primitive planet to the leaders of a galactic resistance movement. The fear broadcasts had failed completely. The humans hadn't just resisted psychological warfare, they had somehow used it to inspire others. What started as a simple planetary conquest had become something the Empire had never faced before. A coordinated multi-system war led by a species that refused to accept defeat. For the first time in Imperial history, the hunters had become the hunted. Captain Ari stood on the bridge of the Imperial Defense Station at Epsilon Base, watching her sensor displays with growing disbelief. The readings made no sense. According to the long-range scanners, a massive fleet was approaching their position, but it wasn't any kind of fleet she had ever seen before. Lieutenant Juan, run those scans again, she ordered, hoping there was some kind of equipment malfunction. The readings can't be correct. Her tactical officer bent over his console, double-checking the data streams. Captain, I've run the scans. 3 times. There are definitely 200 ships approaching our position, but, he paused, shaking his head, half of them are civilian cargo haulers and passenger transport ships. Ari moved to the main viewing screen and zoomed in on the approaching fleet. What she saw there defied everything she knew about space warfare. Leading the formation were actual Imperial warships, clearly captured from previous battles, but behind them flew a bizarre collection of converted civilian vessels. Are those cargo ships carrying weapons? She asked, squinting at the display. Not exactly, Captain, Lieutenant Juan replied, his voice filled with confusion. Our sensors are detecting massive energy signatures, but they're not coming from traditional weapon systems. It looks like they've somehow strapped nuclear devices and primitive explosive charges to civilian transport vessels. Captain Ari had served in the Imperial Navy for 12 years and had fought in dozens of space battles. Never once had she seen an enemy use cargo ships and passenger liners as warships. The very idea was absurd. Civilian vessels had no armor, no shields, no weapon systems. They were designed to carry people and goods, not fight wars. Captain, her communications officer called out, we're receiving a transmission from the lead ship. Put it through, Ari ordered. The main screen flickered, and suddenly she was looking at a human face. The person appeared to be wearing some kind of makeshift military uniform, and behind him she could see what looked like a converted passenger ship bridge, with people frantically working at jury-rigged control stations. Imperial forces, the human said in accented but clear galactic standard language. This is Commander Lee of the Earth Liberation Fleet. You have 30 seconds to evacuate your station before we begin our attack. Ari almost laughed. You're threatening an Imperial defense station with cargo ships and passenger liners. Do you have any idea how heavily armed and shielded this facility is? The human's expression didn't change. 25 seconds. Captain, Lieutenant Juan whispered urgently, should we prepare the defense batteries? Ari studied the approaching fleet again. The whole situation was so ridiculous that she almost felt bad about what was going to happen to these brave but foolish humans. Charge all weapons, let's end this quickly. But as she watched, something incredible happened. The human fleet didn't retreat or try to form defensive positions. Instead, they accelerated directly toward Epsilon Base, and their attack coordination was unlike anything she had ever witnessed. The converted cargo ships split into precise formation groups, moving with a synchronization that should have been impossible for civilian vessels. Passenger liners somehow coordinated their approaches across vast distances, timing their attacks with mathematical precision that violated everything Ari knew about space combat physics. How are they communicating so effectively? She demanded. As her crew scrambled to respond to the chaotic assault, civilian ships don't have military-grade communication arrays. The first wave hit before anyone could answer her question. 3 cargo haulers, their hulls bulging with crude nuclear devices, slammed directly into the station's main defense platforms. The explosions were massive, primitive, and devastatingly effective. In seconds, Epsilon Base lost half of its defensive capabilities. Impossible, Ari breathed, watching as passenger ships somehow managed to deliver precision strikes against their shield generators. Those ships should have been destroyed before they got within weapons range, but the humans weren't using traditional weapons or tactics. They were using their ships as guided missiles, their nuclear devices as close-range bombs, and their seemingly suicidal courage as a weapon that Imperial technology couldn't defend against. The captured Imperial warships in the human fleet provided, covering fire with deadly accuracy, while the converted civilian vessels performed maneuvers that no military strategist would ever consider, because they were too dangerous, too costly, and too insane. Within 2 hours, the impossible had happened. Epsilon Base, one of the Empire's strongest defensive positions, was gone, completely destroyed by an enemy fleet that shouldn't have been able to scratch its shields. Captain Ari found herself floating in an escape pod, watching the wreckage of her command drift through space. Around her, the human fleet was already moving toward their next target, leaving behind only debris and the shocking realization that everything the Empire thought they knew about warfare was wrong. "Emergency transmission to High Command," she spoke into her pod's communication system, her voice shaking with disbelief. "Epsilon Base has fallen. Request immediate fleet reinforcement. The humans are in space. They're using tactics we can't counter, and they're winning." As her escape pod drifted away from the battle site, one thought kept running through her mind. How do you fight an enemy that treats death as just another weapon? Emperor Thane sat alone in his vast throne chamber, surrounded by holographic displays that painted a picture of disaster across the galaxy. The golden walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of Imperial victories now echoed with the sound of crisis reports flooding in from every corner of the Empire. What should have been a simple routine conquest of a primitive world had somehow transformed into the greatest threat the Empire had ever faced. The massive central display showed a 3-dimensional map of Imperial space, and Thane's blood ran cold as he studied it. Red warning indicators flashed like angry stars across dozens of star systems, each one representing a world in open rebellion. The pattern was spreading faster than any plague, jumping from system to system with terrifying efficiency. General Juan, his most trusted military advisor, entered the chamber carrying an armload of intelligence reports. The old soldier's face looked haggard and worn, aged years in just the past few weeks. Thane had never seen his general look so defeated. "Your Excellence," General Juan began, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "the situation has deteriorated beyond our worst projections. The human influence is spreading across the galaxy like wildfire." "Explain," Thane ordered, though he dreaded what he was about to hear. General Juan activated the main display, and the galactic map zoomed in to show detailed reports from across Imperial space. The humans have somehow managed to establish secret communication networks with subjugated species on 47 different worlds. These aren't random uprisings, Excellence. They're coordinated rebellions following human tactical doctrine. Thane leaned forward in his throne. "How is that possible? These species accepted Imperial rule decades ago. They were pacified, controlled, broken." "That's what we thought too, sir," Juan replied grimly. "But the humans have been broadcasting something far more dangerous than weapons or technology. They've been sharing the idea that the Empire can be defeated." The general pulled up intercepted communications from various rebel worlds. Thane listened in horror as he heard familiar alien voices, species that had once cowered before Imperial might, now speaking with the same defiant confidence he had heard from the humans weeks ago. "The Altarians have destroyed 3 Imperial garrison stations using human-designed tactics," General Juan continued. "The mining colonies in the Vega system have gone completely dark. Our supply ships are being attacked by coordinated rebel fleets. Even the Centauri worlds, which have been model Imperial citizens for 30 years, are showing signs of organized resistance." Thane studied the spreading red zones on the galactic map. Each one represented billions of people who had suddenly remembered what it felt like to fight for their freedom. "What about our military response?" "That's our biggest problem, Excellence," Juan said, pulling up fleet disposition reports. "The Third Fleet is completely tied up in the human system. Admiral Quan reports that if he withdraws any significant forces, the humans will likely break through their containment and spread into space with advanced technology. And if we keep the Third Fleet there, we'll lose at least a dozen major systems to these rebellions within the next month. The economic damage alone could bankrupt entire sectors of the Empire." Thane felt the weight of 3 centuries of imperial dominance crushing down on his shoulders. The Empire had been built on the simple principle that resistance was futile, that any species foolish enough to fight would be crushed so thoroughly that others would learn to submit without struggle. But the humans had shattered that principle completely. How are primitives from a single backward planet managing to coordinate rebellion across the entire galaxy? He demanded. General Juan activated another display showing intercepted human transmissions. "They're not just sharing tactics, Excellence. They're sharing hope. Every human broadcast includes detailed accounts of their victories against our forces. Other species are seeing that the Empire can bleed, can be hurt, can even be defeated." The Emperor stared at footage of human civilians celebrating the destruction of Imperial warships, their joy and defiance broadcasting across the galaxy to inspire countless other worlds. It was a virus of rebellion, and the humans were its carriers. "Recommendations?" Thane asked quietly. "We have 2 options, Excellence," General Juan replied. "We can withdraw forces from the human system to suppress the other rebellions, which might allow the humans to develop advanced space technology and become an even greater threat. Or we can commit more forces to finish the human war quickly, before the rebellion spread further." Thane looked at the fleet deployment charts. His first fleet represented the absolute elite of Imperial military power. 60% of their primary battle force, equipped with the most advanced weapons, and crewed by the most experienced officers. "Deploy the first fleet to the human system," he ordered. "Excellence," General Juan said carefully, "that would leave us with minimal forces to defend the core worlds if these rebellions continue spreading." "Deploy them," Thane repeated, his voice filled with cold determination. "End this human threat once and for all. If we don't stop them now, this rebellion will consume the entire Empire." As General Juan left to carry out the orders, Emperor Thane remained alone with the galactic display. The red zone seemed to pulse like a beating heart, pumping rebellion through the arteries of his empire. For the first time in Imperial history, he was gambling everything on a single battle against a species that had already proven they could make the impossible happen. Fleet Admiral Shin stood on the bridge of the massive Imperial flagship final. Victory! Watching through the reinforced viewing ports as the largest space battle in galactic history unfolded around him. The First Fleet stretched out in all directions. Over 300 of the Empire's most advanced warships, crewed by the most experienced officers and equipped with weapons that could shatter planets. This was supposed to be the final blow that would end the human resistance once and for all. The Emperor himself had ordered the deployment of 60% of the Empire's primary battle force, confident that such overwhelming firepower would crush the primitive human defenses within hours. But as Admiral Shin watched the battle rage across the dark void of space, he realized that nothing about this war followed the rules he had learned in 30 years of military service. "Admiral," his tactical officer called out, "the human fleet is approaching from Sector 7. They're using the same mixed formation of captured Imperial ships and converted civilian vessels." Shin studied the tactical display with growing unease. The approaching human fleet was smaller than his force, less advanced, and should have been destroyed the moment they entered weapons range. But he had read the reports from Captain Ari's defeat at Epsilon Base, and he knew these humans fought with tactics that defied military logic. "All ships, prepare for standard engagement," he ordered. "Target their largest vessels first." The Imperial fleet opened fire with devastating precision, their energy weapons lighting up the darkness like deadly fireworks. Several human ships exploded immediately, their primitive armor no match for Imperial firepower. For a moment, Shin allowed himself to hope that this would be a conventional battle after all. Then the humans did something that made his blood run cold. Instead of retreating or trying to return fire from a safe distance, the entire human fleet accelerated directly toward the Imperial ships. But worse than that, the damaged human vessels, the ones that should have been trying to escape or surrender, were deliberately overloading their own reactor cores. "Sir," his communications officer reported in a shaky voice, "we're detecting massive energy buildups in the damaged human ships. They're going to detonate." "Evasive maneuvers," Shin shouted, but it was too late. The first human ship to reach critical reactor failure slammed into the Imperial cruiser Eternal Dominance and exploded with the force of a small star. The massive Imperial warship, which had survived dozens of conventional battles, was torn apart instantly. The explosion was so powerful, it damaged 3 other Imperial vessels nearby. "They're using their own ships as bombs," Lieutenant Hannah whispered from her station, her face pale with shock. This was just the beginning. Over the next 6 hours, Admiral Shin watched his carefully planned battle turn into a nightmare of attrition. The humans employed every tactic that no civilized species would ever consider. They rammed Imperial ships with converted cargo haulers loaded with nuclear weapons. They used passenger liners as guided missiles, sacrificing hundreds of their own people to take down single Imperial cruisers. On the ground, battles raging across Earth's surface, the reports were equally disturbing. Human soldiers fought to the absolute last person, rather than surrender, even when facing impossible odds. They booby-trapped their own positions so that Imperial forces who captured territory would face constant explosions and ambushes. "Casualty. Report, Admiral," his aide whispered, approaching with a data tablet that he seemed reluctant to hand over. Admiral Shin took the report and read the numbers twice, certain there had to be a mistake. In just 1 day of fighting, the First Fleet had lost more ships than the Empire had lost in the previous decade of conquest combined. Over 50,000 Imperial personnel were dead or missing, and they had only managed to secure a handful of human cities. The numbers made no sense from a strategic standpoint. The Empire was technically winning every major engagement. Their weapons were superior, their tactics were sound, and their forces were better trained. But each victory came at such a devastating cost that winning felt like losing. "Admiral," his fleet coordinator reported, "we've received emergency supply requests from 12 different battle groups. Ammunition reserves are running critically low, and we've lost so many ships that our remaining forces are spread too thin to maintain effective coverage." Shin looked out at the ongoing battle and realized he was facing an enemy that had fundamentally changed the mathematics of warfare. The humans weren't trying to win in any conventional sense. They were simply trying to make victory so expensive that the Empire would bankrupt itself achieving it. "Continue the assault," he ordered, his voice heavy with the knowledge that every command he gave was condemning thousands more of his own people to death. But as he watched another human ship ram itself into an Imperial dreadnought, Admiral Shin understood the terrible truth. The humans had discovered something more powerful than any weapon the Empire possessed. They had learned that if you were willing to pay any price, sacrifice anything, endure any loss, you could make even the mightiest enemy question whether victory was worth the cost. The Empire was winning the battle, but the humans were winning something far more dangerous. They were winning the war of mathematics, where every Imperial life lost was worth more to the Empire than human lives were worth to the humans, and that was a war the Empire had never learned how to fight. Emperor Thane sat in the Imperial Strategic Council chamber, surrounded by his most brilliant military minds and economic advisors. The room was filled with holographic displays showing data streams, casualty reports, and economic projections that painted the most terrifying picture the Empire had ever faced. For 3 centuries, this council had planned the conquest of hundreds of worlds, but never before had they gathered to discuss the possibility of defeat. Strategic Advisor Mi stood at the center of the room, her face grim as she presented the mathematical analysis that would change the course of galactic history. The holographic display behind her showed complex calculations that reduced the human war to cold, hard numbers. And those numbers told a story that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. "Your Excellence," Mi began, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to reveal. "We have completed our comprehensive analysis of the human conflict. The projections are disturbing." Emperor Thane leaned forward in his chair, studying the swirling data displays. "Show me the numbers." The hologram shifted to display a massive calculation matrix that took into account troop movements, resource allocation, economic costs, and projected timelines. To achieve complete conquest of the human homeworld would require committing 60% of our total military force to a single star system. Based on current casualty rates and human resistance patterns, the campaign would take a minimum of 20 years to complete. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. 60% of the Imperial military tied up in one system for 2 decades meant the Empire would be defenseless against the spreading rebellions across their territory. "What about the economic cost?" Thane asked, though he suspected the answer would be just as devastating. Strategic Advisor Me activated another display showing resource allocation charts. The sustained military effort would consume 40% of the Empire's total economic output. The cost of replacing destroyed ships and equipment, combined with the loss of tax revenue from rebellious systems, would destabilize our entire economy within 5 years. Defense Minister Tay, a veteran of countless Imperial campaigns, spoke up from his position at the council table. "Excellence, we're essentially being asked to destroy the Empire in order to conquer a single primitive world. The mathematics don't support victory." "And if we withdraw our forces?" Emperor Thane asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The holographic display shifted again, showing projections that were somehow even more frightening than the conquest scenarios. "The humans are reverse engineering captured Imperial technology at a rate that defies our understanding of technological development," Me explained. "What should take them decades to comprehend, they're mastering in months." "How is that possible?" Thane demanded. "We believe it's their unique approach to problem solving," Me replied. "Where other species follow established research protocols, humans appear to use intuitive leaps and experimental trial-and-error methods that somehow work. Our intelligence projections show they will achieve technological parity with the Empire within 5 years." The Emperor felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. "And full spacefaring capability?" 10 years, maximum. Possibly less if they continue. "To capture more of our technology." Defense Minister Tay leaned forward across the council table, his expression grave. "Excellence, there's something else we need to discuss, something that might be even more important than their technological advancement." "Speak." "We've been interrogating human prisoners for weeks now," Tay continued. "What we've discovered is deeply troubling. These humans have perfect memory retention for everything they've experienced during this war. Every Imperial tactic we've used, every weapon system they've seen, every weakness they've observed in our forces. They remember all of it in precise detail." The implication hit Emperor Thane like a physical blow. "You're saying they're learning from every engagement?" "More than that, Excellence. They're not just learning, they're teaching. Every human prisoner we've captured has been sharing detailed tactical knowledge with other humans through methods we don't fully understand. It's like their entire species is becoming a collective military intelligence." Strategic Advisor Mai brought up the final projection, and the room fell silent as everyone stared at the terrifying possibility displayed in front of them. "If we withdraw from the human system and allow them to develop advanced space travel, they will possess 3 critical advantages: technological parity with the Empire, detailed knowledge of all our military capabilities, and a species-wide hatred for everything we represent. They will come for us," Emperor Thane said quietly, the words barely audible. "Yes, Excellence," Defense Minister Tay confirmed, "and they will never stop. Every human we've encountered shows the same psychological profile. They don't forget injuries, they don't forgive enemies, and they don't give up. If we allow them to reach the stars, they will hunt the Empire across the galaxy." Emperor Thane stared at the holographic displays, showing 2 equally impossible choices: destroy the Empire trying to conquer humanity, or withdraw and create an enemy that would eventually destroy the Empire anyway. For the first time in 3 centuries of imperial dominance, the mathematics of war offered no path to victory. Emperor Thane stood alone in his private chambers high above the imperial capital, gazing out through the massive transparisteel windows at the site that had symbolized his power for decades. Hundreds of imperial warships floated in perfect formation above the planet, their hulls gleaming in the light of the system's twin suns. For 3 centuries, those ships had carried the Empire's might to every corner of the galaxy, spreading imperial rule to world after world without ever facing defeat. Tonight, for the first time in imperial history, those ships would be ordered to retreat. The weight of that decision pressed down on Thane's shoulders like the gravity of a dying star. He had spent sleepless nights reviewing the Strategic Council's reports, running the mathematics again and again, hoping to find some alternative that didn't require him to make the most humiliating decision in imperial history. But no matter how he looked at the numbers, the conclusion was always the same. The Empire could not afford to win this war. With trembling hands, he activated the secure communication channel that connected him directly to Fleet Admiral Shin aboard the final Victory. The holographic image of his admiral appeared instantly, showing a man who looked like he had aged decades in just a few weeks of fighting humans. "Your Excellence," Admiral Shin said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I was about to send you our latest casualty reports. The First Fleet has taken significant losses, but we're still making progress. With reinforcements, we could achieve complete victory within—" "Admiral," Thane interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you are hereby ordered to implement complete withdrawal from the human system, effective immediately." The silence that followed stretched for several long seconds. Admiral Shin's image flickered, as if the communication system itself couldn't believe what it had just transmitted. "Excellence, I'm not sure I understand. Did you say withdrawal?" "Complete withdrawal," Thane repeated, each word feeling like poison in his mouth. "All Imperial forces are to evacuate the human system within 72 hours, no exceptions. But, Excellence, we can still achieve victory. Yes, the costs have been higher than expected, but with additional support we could—" "Admiral, you will implement withdrawal. That is a direct order from your Emperor." The pain in Admiral Shin's eyes was visible, even through the holographic projection. "Excellence, may I ask what official reason we're giving for this strategic repositioning?" Thane had prepared for this question, though the lie tasted bitter on his tongue. "The official statement will declare that humanity has proven their worthiness for independence through their brave resistance. They are hereby granted protected species status and will be allowed to govern themselves without imperial interference." "And the real reason, Excellence?" Thane looked out at his fleet again, seeing not symbols of power, but reminders of how close the Empire had come to destroying itself. "The real reason remains classified at the highest level, Admiral. You will follow your orders." The truth was too dangerous to speak aloud, even on a secure channel. The Empire had discovered something more terrifying than any weapon or enemy they had ever faced, a species that made victory too expensive to achieve. The humans had somehow figured out how to turn their own weakness into strength, their own deaths into weapons, their own primitive technology into tools that could bring down the mightiest galactic civilization. The Empire could win the war against humanity, but the cost would leave them so weakened that the spreading rebellions across imperial space would tear them apart. They would destroy themselves in the process of destroying Earth, leaving behind only ruins for humanity's descendants to inherit when they eventually reach the stars. "Prepare long-term monitoring stations at the edge of the human system," Thane ordered. "I want constant surveillance of their technological development. If humanity achieves faster-than-light travel, I want to know the moment it happens." "Understood, Excellence. Shall I prepare the withdrawal announcement for the fleet?" "Yes, and, Admiral, make sure our people understand this is not a defeat. This is a strategic decision to preserve Imperial strength for more important objectives." After ending the communication, Emperor Thane remained alone with the terrible knowledge that he had just made the first Imperial retreat in 3 centuries. The official histories would record it as a magnanimous gesture toward a brave but primitive species. The classified files would tell a different story. In those secret reports, Admiral Shin's final assessment would haunt future Imperial leaders. This species will be among the stars within a generation. They will remember everything we did here. Every tactic we used, every weakness they discovered, every injury we inflicted. When they develop advanced space travel, they will come for us. Recommend immediate preparation of defensive strategies. The next war with humans will be fought on our worlds, not theirs. Emperor Thane sealed that report with the highest classification level in Imperial archives. But as he watched his mighty fleet begin its shameful withdrawal, he knew that somewhere in the darkness between the stars, humanity was already building the ships that would one day carry their terrible mathematics directly to the Empire's door. The hunters had become the hunted, and the galaxy would never be the same.